2001. Steve is on a 4-week training detail to keep fresh on SHIELD protocol in prematurely cold Montana, of all places, when he hears about it. The base he's on is probably the most remote one SHIELD's got in the United States, barring maybe locations in Alaska, which is still a newly minted part of the country to him. Because of this, they only get cell service on the fancy SHIELD satellite phone, which means the duration of each call is pretty limited. He is waiting for Peggy to call, Barton sitting off in the corner with a badly affected air of nonchalance. One of his hearing aids, the left one Steve thinks, got trampled on the course this morning, and so, as Barton cheerfully announced earlier, his hearing is completely for shit. Steve doesn't think that's all that's going on, though. Barton seems antsy about his turn with the phone, and it's probably because he recently brought in a new recruit, and he's nervous about how she's settling in. Rumor has it she's the infamous Black Widow, but Barton calls her Romanoff most of the time, and some variant of Natasha when he thinks the others can't hear. Steve is also pretty sure that Barton is certifiably insane. Still, he's a better shot than even Bucky was, as much as Steve would never say it. Steve also kind of feels he should apologize to the picture of Buck he's got stuffed in his wallet for speaking ill, not of the dead, but rather of Buck's much-lauded ability during leave to shoot a bottle to bits from increasingly improbable distances and increasingly improbable contortions, usually to the drunken laughter of everyone.
Finally, the phone lights up, but it's with Kat's name. Still, that's not too unusual. Kat's a busy woman with a career, a husband, and kids, but she makes time to go see her parents on occasion, and maybe she thought Peggy would be lonely with Steve gone for 4 weeks. Steve answers and barely gets out a hello when it's a bit like December 7th, 1941 all over again.
The way the moment rushes up to meet him, like biting the pavement from a punch to the nose and knowing you're going down, and yet somehow still not expecting it, the way his limbs turn heavy and cold with abrupt terror. "Dad!" Kat gasps into the phone. "Dad, it's really bad. It's really bad. The towers are just collapsing. They had planes. I don't know how they had planes and they got the Pentagon. They're at the Pentagon. Tell me. Oh, Dad, tell me you're not in the city." Kat, Steve says firmly and then gently. "I'm just fine. I'm all right. I'm in Montana, remember? Real far away. I need you to take a breath, okay? I love you. Breathe for me." Kat does. He can hear her gasping slow through the tiny speaker, and he shuts his eyes tight and gives himself a second to panic. Over the line, Catherine's calmed, and so Steve makes himself calm too. She tells him, "Sorry. Okay, Christ, I can't. I'm passing the phone to Mom." Steve presses the back of his hand to his mouth, moves it away, and waits for Peggy to come on. He can hear the tension in her voice when she tells him what's happened to his country, his city, his home. He knows she wants to be out there helping, because he does too, but he's stuck in Montana and already knows there's no way anyone is going to be flying, not after this. He closes his eyes and shakes his head as he listens. Barton has stopped pretending not to watch and is standing ready, because he's good enough to know when something has happened and good enough to know when he needs to be prepared. Peggy's voice is trailing off when she tells him, "Steve, you come home as soon as you can. You come home to us, and then you go do what you can to help." And Steve knows how that is, remembers how well Peggy knows him, because she was there 1,000,000 years ago when he set his jaw and wouldn't take no for an answer, and she knows she can't stop him when he gets this way. "Okay," agrees Steve. "I love you, Pegs, and tell Kat I love her too. I'll be there as soon as I can." Steve hangs up and beckons Barton closer so he can hear. "Somebody flew planes into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. We're in for a hell of a ride, Barton." A lot of things happen very quickly on Barton's face. He swallows hard and says, "Fuck," looking jarred and terrified. And then suddenly, to Steve's shock, he straightens himself up and sets his shoulders, more serious than Steve's ever seen him. "Call me Clint, sir," he says. Steve recognizes that look in his eye. It's the look all snipers get when they've finally sighted their target, and now it's just a matter of time until their target is in range. That moment of perfect stillness. This is what Steve is good at. Not the spying, not the covert ops, not really even being a soldier. This is what Steve is good at, pulling people together and holding them up when they need it most. "Tell everybody to pack up and get the cars ready. We're going to D.C. Steve takes a deep breath and calls Fury's line. He'll be busy, but not too busy to deal with Steve Rogers informing him that he's leaving Montana with 20-some agents and heading for cleanup duty. Tony is the next person who calls him, getting through once they reach the nearest town. Tony likes explosions as much as Howard ever did, or possibly, terrifyingly more. But he also likes people about 10 times the amount that his father did, which is probably why he can be so difficult to deal with. That's not to say that Tony will ever admit to liking people. From experience, Steve has decided that he infinitely prefers this to Howard's method, which was to hate people privately and put on a very convincing show of loving them publicly. Tony doesn't sound drunk, which is odd, and the conversation is short, which is also odd. Normally, Tony takes about 15 minutes to get to his point, if not more, and that's assuming there's any point to begin with. "Tony?" Steve asks after Tony's said hi and then nothing else. "Hey, son. You okay?" Sure, yeah, I'm fine. Wasn't in D.C. or New York or anything, I'm fine." That's not what Steve meant, and Tony knows it, so he doesn't give Steve a chance to interrupt. "Hey, you remember how I was thinking about shutting down some of the weapons lines 'cause, hey, nobody's using them?" There's a huff of laughter that doesn't sound a whole lot like laughter. "Yeah, I'm probably not going to do that anymore, huh?" Steve has to take a minute to think of what to say. "Tony," he finally comes up with, a little careful and trying not to sound careful, "you can do whatever you want with Stark Industries. It's your company." This is mostly the truth. It's Tony's name on the products, at least. Tony's response is stilted. Yeah, of course. But, well, I mean... Steve terribly does. "I know, Tony." Tony hangs up abruptly, and Steve can't say he really blames him. They'll be in D.C. in another 20 hours or so. Steve spends a lot of the drive there thinking of how he's going to go to New York and do everything he can, which is more than most people, but still not nearly enough. New York, September 14th. Amid rescue and cleanup workers yesterday was Steve Rogers, known also as Captain America, the World War II hero whose serum-induced body allowed him to perform superhuman feats of strength and also to keep his youthful looks. Rogers' past has been fraught with scandal, leading to, many claim, his reclusiveness over the last few decades. This is the first time since his arrest in 1972 that he has been seen in public, though he was not wearing the iconic Captain America uniform, instead working side by side with rescue workers and lifting rubble too heavy for one man and too delicate for machinery. Regardless of his past, we here in New York City are glad to have our fellow New Yorker to help us out. Roberts Josephine, Captain America Back in New York, The New York Times, 14th September 2001. Print.
From here, no lines are drawn.
2004. Steve is starting to get used to funerals. Dugan passed on first, then Falsworth, and Denier a few years later, and of course Stark died first in the crash back in '91, whether Steve cares to remember it or not. Tony's at this funeral, which Steve thinks is odd until he remembers how much Tony likes Kat. Kat's supporting Joe through his loss, pretending she's not torn up about losing Jim, and so Tony is probably hoping to help out Kat, distract Jamie and Tim, whatever. Tony's a good kid, even though no one would ever admit that. Ms. Potts, Tony's PA of 4 years, is also there, which Steve figures is a good sign considering Ms. Potts always manages to keep Tony on a leash. Steve keeps telling himself he's getting used to funerals, but the truth is he's not. And besides, when was the last time the funeral was for a member of his family? His mom's funeral? Does Bucks count, since Steve's the one who got his flag? Steve has tuned most of what the pastor is saying out, a habit learned from years of Catholic school and Catholic church and apparently works regardless of denomination, but he catches the end when the man says, "And now Mr. Morida's son would like to say a few words." Joe stands, slowly lets go of Kat's hand, and takes the microphone. "I remember when I first fell in love with Kat, the woman who would become my wife," he says, voice sad but also a little amused. "When I came home from our third date, I had what must have been the most idiotic smile on my face, and Dad took one look at me and said, 'Oh no, you've fallen in love.' I must have gone pretty pale at that point, because he took my shoulder, sat me down, and poured me a glass of scotch. Keep in mind, my dad was not typically a drinking man, but he poured himself a glass about twice the size of mine before he sat down." The crowd chuckles a little, sniffles a lot, and Joe keeps talking. Steve had no idea his son-in-law was so good at talking to crowds. "So my dad looks me in the eye and he says, 'Ace, people are going to tell you it's a bad idea to fall in love with Captain America's daughter. They might even be right. And they're going to tell you that falling in love with a white girl is going to be hard. And they'll definitely be right. But you remember this. Kat's not just the daughter of a famous guy, she's her own person, and so are you. You both keep that in mind, and you'll be just fine." And then he tipped back his scotch, clapped me on the shoulder, and went to bed. And that was my dad. He always remembered that people were people first, no matter what. Afterward, Steve and Gabe pour glasses of Glenfiddich, but they make no toasts, and they keep the shot count to 2. (2006) In the past year, I have been afforded the privilege of sitting in on a class at Harvard University. It is a course offered only to upperclassmen in the English Literature Department, titled The 13 Letters, an Examination. Over the course of the semester, students were assigned to do close readings of at least 5 of the now timeless wartime love letters written by Sergeant James Buchanan Barnes. This means that students would approach Barnes's letters as a complete literary work and analyze it as such, combing through the text for imagery, symbolism, and metaphor. This is groundbreaking, as it marks the first instance of Barnes's letters being studied not for their historical or socio-political relevance, but rather purely for their artistic merit. After 2 days of auditing the class, I couldn't help but wonder how no one had ever studied the letters in this way before. Barnes was no conventional writer. Public records tell us that he attended school until the 7th grade and then dropped out in order to find a job, as many boys of the time did. Despite this, Barnes's grasp of the English language is by turns electrifying and anguished. He expresses effortlessly an entire range of human emotion, even with his lack of formal education, his poverty-stricken upbringing, and his age. Speaking of age, James Barnes died in a battle at a criminally young 26 after seeing combat for a little less than 2 years. This means that he penned his surviving creations between 1943 and 1945, arguably the most dangerous period of the war. His killed-in-action status makes his vibrant account of love and loss all the more poignant. Had he lived longer, Barnes may have become America's greatest wartime novelist. As it is, he unintentionally joined the ranks of O'Brien and Vonnegut with his unapologetic approach to the incendiary topics of violence and sexuality. Each hour in the classroom was focused on discussion rather than traditional lectures. One day in late November, the homework assignment had been to prepare any kind of story detailing your own personal experience with the aspects of the letters that had gained even more fame after being integrated into popular culture. Several students showed up in the familiar t-shirt with Barnes's army photograph printed above a large slanting repetition of "Love is love is love." One senior brought a movie poster signed by director Joe Wright of the controversial 2002 film Unrequited. Memorably, near the end of class, another young man pulled up his shirt to show off a tattoo on his ribs that read in a simple font, "I loved you first," a beloved quote from Barnes's final letter. He shared that he got the tattoo because his mother, who had died of breast cancer 2 years earlier, treasured the honesty and universality of Barnes's letters. At the end of the semester, Professor Allison Chen, to every student's immense relief, made an announcement that there would be no final, cumulative or otherwise. Instead, there was a small assignment, a one-page paper, no longer than 1,200 words, detailing each student's emotional reaction to the letters as a whole. I spoke to students after their last paper was due. It was, in total honesty, I think the hardest paper I've ever had to write at this school. One junior, a whooping double major in English and engineering, told me. I didn't realize how emotional the letters made me, but over the course of the semester, I just got so invested in this man's story. He bared his soul, and so I wanted to be generous in return. It was so hard to keep it short enough to turn in and still express all that I felt. She confessed, laughing, that she ended up writing 11 pages, which she spruced up and submitted to the Harvard Crimson, where it will be published as an article in the spring. There are 2 sides, however, to every story. Chen's lecture series, unfortunately, could not fully address the other man who played an integral role in Barnes's life, as very little is actually known about him. It's a question for the ages. Were these letters truly addressed to Steve Rogers? All evidence seems to point in that direction, even though Rogers has never spoken about the content of the letters, not even to confirm or deny if they were in fact written to him. As for Rogers himself, he has joined in on a number of demonstrations made by the LGBT community. He is rumored to have donated huge amounts, anonymously of course, to various LGBT organizations, and has championed in campaigns for HIV/AIDS fundraising, research, and education. The public, being the public, will continue to speculate. It seems increasingly likely, with every passing year, however, that Barnes's love was truly and tragically unreturned. Hendrix Naomi, The 13 Letters, 40 Years Later, Time Magazine, print.
You are my sweetest downfall. I loved you first. I loved you first. Beneath the sheets of paper lies my truth. I have to go. I have to go.
The reporters just outside are raising all kinds of hell. Steve shifts where he stands, trying hard not to think of all the people out there. He hasn't done a press conference since the 60s, when he was still letting Stark use him as a mouthpiece, just after President Kennedy was killed. Steve's hands aren't shaking. They didn't shake when he put the plane in the water, they didn't shake when Erskine strapped him into the Vita-Ray. But he is ridiculously, after 60 years in the public eye, nervous about this. Beside him, Tony is texting someone lightning quick. Steve figures it was a good deal of blackmail and pointed stares on Kat's part that convinced Tony to be here today, as neither Peggy nor Kat were able to, in a show of moral support. Or maybe just as a distraction. Knowing Tony and knowing how Kat knows Steve, it's probably the latter. Tony snaps his phone shut and pushes it into his back pocket. Sure you don't want me to prep him for you? I could, loosen him up a bit. Not necessary, Steve grits. He doesn't have any note cards. He has no idea what he's supposed to say. He wishes for a ludicrous moment that he had his shield on him. Not the one he still uses on the odd recon mission, but the old one. The one made of painted plywood that he used to tape his lines onto the back of. Jesus Christ, Rogers, thinks Steve. This is a bad idea. Tony looks insanely uncomfortable. He's not very good with words of encouragement, which is frankly no surprise, considering who tried to raise him. Steve berates himself again. He shouldn't think ill of the dead, not even when he wants to turn tail and make a run for it. The crowd outside saves Tony the trouble of a stilted emotional moment, though. They've settled, a silence hushing over them. Well, get out there, Cap, Tony says, slapping him on the back with his free hand. His phone has made an appearance again. No one has called Steve that in 35 years. Kiss some hands, shake some babies. Steve steels himself, squares his shoulders, and walks out. Cameras flash, and someone, thank God for them, must have directed the reporters to stay seated, or else. So there's no vicious clambering when they see Steve. A few hold-out microphones, a few others tape recorders. The room is so quiet you could hear a goddamn pin drop. Steve is afraid to break the silence. Hello, he says after a moment of hovering. His voice echoes hugely in the quiet room. I haven't been around a lot. I don't think my career choices are really what you've come to hear about, though. It's not really a joke, but either way it falls completely flat. Steve takes a breath and says, I think I better start at the beginning. I had a best friend growing up. You all know about him. He was... Christ. I don't even think I can explain him. I won't do him justice if I try. He was giving. Caring. Funny. Real good dancer to boot. The ladies loved him. We had a lot of burdens growing up when we did, and with the war looming over us. But I remember that when he wasn't working, he was out at the dance halls, and when he was doing that, he was nothing but a carefree kid. But the thing is, beneath that, like anyone back then who ever thought of someone of the same gender in a romantic way, he was scared as hell. You gotta remember, it wasn't just frowned upon, it was illegal. Buck and me, we lived in a pretty open neighborhood, I guess you could say, but that didn't make it any less dangerous for him or for anyone else. A lot of people lived in fear. I didn't know those letters existed, Steve continues. He looks out at their faces. Most of them seem unfazed so far, as if they've been expecting this, and are now ready for Steve's gently worded confession that he's straighter than an arrow and has a wife and a family to prove that in spades. Jesus Christ. Steve swallows. I didn't know they existed, he repeats. And if I had, If I had, my life would probably have been a whole lot different. For one, I wouldn't have been so scared of the way I felt about Buck. I didn't know it, not for a long time. But I loved him. And don't misquote me because I mean that. I was in love with him. I was in love with James Barnes. I've been in love with him for as long as I can remember. I may not look it, Steve continues, quiet now, but I'm an old man. All the guys I fought with are dead, but I'm still here, looking about as old as my grandkids do. I see no reason to hide from it anymore. I've had decades to figure myself out. I'm telling you in the hopes that I can help anyone who's felt as scared or wrong or prosecuted as Bucky and I did. So here it is. I'm bisexual. My wife and I are still happy as anything to be together. I love her to this day, and I'll always love her, the same as I'll always love Bucky. For a long moment, the room is silent. And then it bursts into noise and camera flashes in motion, and Tony comes to Steve's rescue and causes a whole outburst of pandemonium on his own, waving an arm around and smiling vaguely behind his sunglasses, giving Steve a free second to escape while his heart pounds in its chest like it's trying to break out. All right, Jesus, none of you were this excited when my sex tape leaked. He didn't tell me it was being televised, says Peggy from her armchair when Steve finally comes home, having walked all the way back. Summer is creeping up on them, and he's sweating a bit at his forehead and the small of his back. He's calmer now, the walk having helped him, the adrenaline wearing off. He pours himself a glass of water and refills hers before returning to kiss her on the cheek and sit at the corner of the couch closest to her. Wolf Blitzer is on mute, talking via Skype with a woman. The ticker tape reads, Captain America Confessional. I was in love with James Barnes. Steve is just grateful she's watching CNN instead of Fox. He doesn't know what Bill O'Reilly has to say about this, but he can imagine. The TV flicks off and Peggy turns her head to look at him. She smiles at Steve and he smiles back helplessly, relieved to be home and away from all those flashing cameras. There's a reason he thinks that he's been avoiding the press for so long. It's even more exhausting than he remembered. Peggy reaches out and cups his face in her hand, the wistful expression fading from her face. You look just the same as the day we met, says Peggy softly. It's a blatant lie. Steve, who finally has one entire gray hair, looks absolutely nothing like the skinny kid she first laid eyes on back in 43. But Steve understands what she means, the way that two people stupid in love always do. She looks just the same to him, too. Whole year older than you on the inside, though, Steve replies. Older, probably, Peggy says. Her brow is furrowed now, and Steve clasps his hand over hers. Her eyes search his. We were happy, weren't we? She asks as though wondering at the fact of it. Despite all of it, we were happy. I'll never know how we managed that. Steve's throat closes up, and he says truthfully, Happiest. We were the happiest, Pegs. Was it worth it to you? She asks. Every single second, Steve replies. I wouldn't have traded you for the world. Peggy looks at him for a moment longer and then drops her hand from his face, curling her strong fingers around his. She takes a shaky breath, and Steve is concerned immediately, but she's fine, only thoughtful. Her voice is rough when she speaks again. In a moment, I'm going to beg you for forgiveness, because I think it's unfair of me to ask for it before I tell you. You were so brave today, and it did nothing but remind me of my own cowardice. Concerned now, Steve shakes his head. What are you talking about, Peggy? I've done terrible things, Peggy says, hushed. I've done terrible things, Steve. I've lied to you. 1943. Steve's red pencil is worn down almost all the way to the nub, but he only needs a little more shade in the space just between the building across from him and the beginning of the sunset. He takes a moment to shave at it with his pocket knife before bending back over his sketchbook, kicking his feet into the empty air below him. There's a commotion at the front door as Bucky gets in. Steve snorts to himself when he hears Buck step on the loose nail in the floorboard and let out a colorful string of curses for what must be the 6th time in as many days. Barefoot, Bucky climbs out the window Steve's left open and joins him on the tiny fire escape. That was a new one, Steve comments. Bucky hums and leans over to see Steve's drawing. He smells like he always does after work, a mix of sea salt and sweat salt and cigarette smoke, his arm pressed damp and warm against Steve's. He looks at the sketch pad in Steve's hands for a second and then out at the sunset, squinting. Steve flips to the next page and scratches down, fast but precise as he can, Buck's profile, illuminated by the dying orange and pink light of the sun. "So what's your story, Morning Glory? Want to go out tonight?" asks Bucky. He glances down at the sketch pad again, smiling a little when he sees what Steve's switched to drawing. He always wants to go out. Steve raises an eyebrow, still focused on getting down the line of Bucky's brow. "Shouldn't you be getting ready for tomorrow?" Bucky leans back on his elbows and shrugs. "I don't think there's a better way to get ready for basic than dancing." "Well, guess I wouldn't know," Steve replies before he can check himself. Bucky looks at him sharply. "Hey," he says, "none of that." Steve sighs. If they've had this argument once, they've had it a million times. "Buck, it's only basic," tries Bucky again. "Steve!" "Buck, will you look at me? Jesus!" Steve huffs and glares at him. "What's got you all worked up?" asks Bucky quietly. He's leaning in so close that their foreheads are almost touching. "I know you want to get out there, and I know that you're sore about me getting in and you not, but you gotta hear me. It's like I keep telling you." "It's not just that," Steve says. He looks at Buck helplessly, wishing for the words to come. The truth is that he and Bucky haven't been apart for longer than maybe a week in the last decade, and he's not entirely sure what he's supposed to get up to without him. Bucky's his only real friend in the whole entire world. The only thing he has is Bucky. And if Bucky goes out there, if Bucky dies out there, Steve has no goddamn idea how he's supposed to forgive himself for not being right beside him the whole time. First and foremost, Steve wants to fight for his country. But now that the future is coming up to meet them, Steve thinks more and more about Bucky alone out there, about letters that could get lost so easy in the mail, about, ridiculously, how cold Bucky's feet get at night. It's a weird role reversal, Steve worrying about Bucky this way. Their balance has been upset by it, but Steve can't help himself. "And what is it?" pushes Buck, clueless asshole that he is. His voice is a little reedy. "You gotta tell me, Steve. You gotta tell me. I can't fight with you tonight." Defeated, Steve shakes his head, looking at Bucky and summoning up a smile for him. "It's not you, Buck. I just had a long day. It isn't you, huh?" "You're better off here," says Bucky, quiet and firm. "You hear me? Someone's gotta hold down the fort until I get back." He pauses for a second, and Steve can hear the joviality in his voice, even if it's faked. "Who knows? Maybe you'll even learn how to cook me a decent meal without burning the whole complex down first. And you can write me letters so I won't get bored." "Smart ass," says Steve, softening. "Like hell I'm cooking you dinner. I'm not your girl, Barnes." "No," Buck says, looking at him. He smiles, but it comes out strange. "No, guess you aren't." Silence falls over them. Bucky looks back out at the sunset, just the last strains of it, and Steve finishes up his sketch by the light he has left, drawing the sharp, strong line of Buck's jaw, the bulge in his Adam's apple, and then shading in the 5 o'clock shadow which he'll have shaved off by tomorrow. Bucky appears to decide to drop it, because just then he rummages in his discarded jacket pocket. "Saw you were running low," he explains, handing over the new pencils he must have just bought on the way home. "So, just in case." Steve thinks for one horrific, embarrassing moment that, honest to God, he's going to cry. Their balance is upset. Bucky, much as he'd never admit it, and Steve would never, ever say it, is the crier out of the two of them. Steve remembers Buck's frustrated tears 2 winters ago when Steve almost died in the night, spilling warm and wet over Steve's hand while Buck thought he was sleeping. He cries when he's scared. And now, right now, Buck's scared. He does a hell of a job hiding it, but he can't hide anything from Steve. He's been saying goodbye to Steve in little ways for weeks now, stuffing all his cash under the ratty couch cushions, sorting his civvies into clothes that might fit Steve and clothes that are falling apart at the seams, and now this, giving Steve pencils before he leaves because he knows damn well that Steve's not going to buy them for himself while Buck's gone. It's all because Bucky's got this idea in his head that his ticket out of Brooklyn is one way only. Steve takes the gift, and because he doesn't know how to do anything but wear his heart on his sleeve today, Buck's brow furrows. "They the right ones?" he asks, concerned. Jesus Christ, James Buchanan Barnes, says Steve, shoving hard at Bucky's shoulder, angry and disbelieving and somehow suddenly elated all at once. Bucky laughs and grins that grin that could start a riot. God damn, they must be perfect if you're saying that, Buck teases. You better be planning to scrub all that smug off if you want a single dame to look at you tonight. Steve moves to shut his notebook, but Bucky catches his hand by the wrist and stops him, looking down at the half-done sketch of himself on the page. Hey, why are you drawing me? I'm not even shipping out yet, Bucky says, sounding a little rough. It's only 10 weeks anyway. You're not getting sentimental on me, are you? You wish, Steve says, kicking Bucky's bare foot with his own, but he doesn't move away, and Buck doesn't either, and so they end up with their legs tangled together. Bucky is the subject of about 80% of Steve's sketches anyway. Steve almost tells him, but he stops himself and says instead, just documenting your ugly mug so I can show all the girls how handsome I am in comparison. I keep trying to convince them you're the looker, Bucky says, absent and honest. You sure you don't mind dancing tonight? Nah, says Steve, a little despondently. Go get scrubbed up. I know you want to go out. Oh, come on, don't be so serious, Buck cajoles. Not like there won't be plenty of time for me to bug you all night and day between basic and the war, right? Steve looks over at him. Just want you to be careful is all, he says, echoing a statement he's heard from Bucky 1,000 times. Bucky stands, brushing off his pants and heading back inside. Over his shoulder he calls, None of that now, I'm your bad Penny Rogers. I'll be turning up under your shoe until the day you die. Wait and see. From the sketchbook, Buck looks out at something in the distance, his eyes squinted against the sunset, the light long gone by now. "2006. Peggy, unable to meet his gaze, begins to talk. There were only the rumors. The man had been alive for far too long, you see. Howard and I had assumed that it was several men over the years in the same costume, but then we received reliable intel, a file from as far back as 46 that corroborated with yours about the arm. We were forced to conclude that it was the same person. And then a few years after Leningrad, Stark's informant successfully infiltrated the Winter Soldier Project. They called him. Peggy's voice catches. I'm sorry, Steve. They called him the American. Stark's informant gathered as much information as he could. The soldier healed fast, too fast. We believed that they were experimenting on him, but that's as much as I know, because soon after, Stark's informant was discovered and he was executed. The Red Room, that is, they sent photographs to warn us, and in one of them... Steve, please believe me, it was only the side of his face. The photograph was blurred and grainy. We couldn't know for sure. We never knew for sure. His hair was a little longer, but he wasn't wearing a mask, and Steve, I'm so sorry. It looked like him. Steve realizes he is shaking, his breath caught in his chest. He's unable to breathe, feeling like his lungs are closing up, like his asthma is back again, like Pearl Harbor, like 9/11. His limbs have gone cold and heavy, an unspeakable dread clawing at his throat the way the ice claws at Bucky's in his nightmares. Like who, Peggy? He says. Peggy wraps her hands tighter around his and says urgently, We didn't have the technology for facial recognition. It was 1962, and it was impossible, Steve. It all seemed so impossible. Steve has never begged, not once in all his years, not when Peggy asked him to leave, not even for his ma's life, not even for Bucky's. He's begging now. His voice is filled with a need so raw and base that he can hardly recognize it. Peggy, please tell me, please. It was James Barnes, Peggy confesses in a whisper. There are tears in her eyes. Oh, Steve, it was him. Steve's heart pounds in his limbs, and around him the world seems to slow. Dimly he tries to reconcile it. Steve left him. He left him. But only because there couldn't have been a body. There wasn't time to look. No one could have survived. Zola's lab. gunshot wound behind enemy lines that healed in 2 days, how Buck would drink with the other guys, drink a lot, but never quite past tipsy. In the letters, how Buck said, they shot him up with cocktails among cocktails of chemicals. Realization comes like a punch, like the hard fist in Leningrad that knocked the air completely out of him. He was there. He was right there. And his arm, the arm, Buck. Terribly, miserably, Peggy continues. We were convinced we couldn't tell you. It would have compromised us. The balance was too delicate. We were facing a nuclear war. If you had known, Steve, if you had known that there was even the slightest possibility, I knew that you'd tear the world apart. And all for him. You would tear the world apart to find him, and you wouldn't give a damn about anything else. She's right. God help him, she's right. You would have destroyed everything we had worked for. You would have tipped the nation into a world war, and the stakes were too high, and I knew that I couldn't let you do that. She's crying now, the tears falling slowly. God forgive me, Steve. I am so sorry. You didn't know me in Leningrad, Steve realizes. And maybe it makes Steve selfish, but this is worse than the arm. This is worse than anything. Scared and childlike, he asks, Pegs, he didn't. I know, Peggy whispers. Stark's informant. He told us. Steve, She collects herself visibly and then continues. It was electroconvulsive. They wiped him. They wiped his memory, not just once, but after every single mission. The pain pierces Steve like a stab wound to the gut. It's worse than anything he's ever felt. He had thought, after Bucky fell from the train, he was so sure that it was the worst pain he could ever feel, that shock of initial agony followed by miles and miles of colorless grief. Nothing, Steve knew that night, trying to get drunk in a bombed-out bar, could feel worse than this. He was wrong. Howard and I thought he was deactivated in the 80s. We were so sure he was gone. There wasn't a single trace left of him, and by the time the KGB was disbanded, we thought the horror was finally over. He killed Steve. He was the assassin who killed the president. This blow lands more softly, perhaps because there's no room left for shock in Steve's body. Stalin, too, Steve knows. And how many others? How many did they make him kill? And what did they do to him? How else did they break him to make him do it? Steve hears like it was yesterday Bucky's delirious mumblings in the Hydra base. James Barnes, Sergeant 32557038, Sergeant 32557. How long did he repeat that to the Soviets? How long until they stripped it from him, too? But there were no records, you understand. Just the one photograph, and then... Peggy looks at Steve, shaking her head. More tears fall, but she makes no move to brush them away. Her voice is cracking now, very finely, like splintered china. Howard thought someone was watching his house, but you knew him, and even me. I thought it was the drink or the drugs, something causing the paranoia. He had his eccentricities, so none of us listened, and eventually he hired a security detail. Then, the night he died, he raised hell with Maria about keeping Tony at home. You knew something was wrong, didn't you? Peggy asks. You deleted the message he left because you didn't want me to hear it. Yeah, I did, Steve admits. He knows what's coming next now. It's inevitable. He remembers the panic in Stark's voice, how Stark said Peggy's name like it was a warning. And Steve realizes that the last thing Stark saw that night, after the Winter Soldier pulled Maria through the windshield and broke her body on the pavement, after he ripped the door off its hinges and hurled it into the snow, the last thing Stark saw was Bucky Barnes, a ghost from 60 years past. And he knew that death had come for him. You were right to delete it, Peggy continues, her voice thick with guilt. He left a message at my office. He must have called me first. All Howard said was, he's coming. And that's when I knew how wrong I had been to keep it from you for so long. How wrong we had all been. We were wrong, we fucked up. Rogers, listen to me. Peggy brushes her tears away now. There's one more thing, only one more, Steve. I feel that I owe it to you above all else. Numbly, Steve meets her gaze. What more could there possibly be? It's another reason why I didn't tell you, she says. The real reason, maybe. Steve doesn't speak. He doesn't think he can. Instead, he holds her look and waits. I'm selfish, Peggy confesses brokenly. I have loved you so much, and love made me selfish. I knew that if I told you, I would lose you. And the terrible thing, the worst thing, is that Steve knows down to his bones that this is true, that Peggy is, as always, right. He would have left. He would have torn the world apart to bring Bucky home, and he wouldn't have looked back. Peggy is truly crying now, curled in on herself, her hand covering her eyes as her body shakes. Steve can't stand to watch it. Doesn't know if he's angry or hurt or betrayed, or if he forgives her or not, or if he ever can. It's not that he doesn't understand her reasoning, because he does. That makes it no easier to reconcile. Steve knows only that he loves her, and wants her to not hurt over it anymore. She's unburdened herself, and the truth belongs to Steve now. It is his weight to carry. He wants to carry it. Carefully, he takes her hands in his. It's all right, murmurs Steve, pressing their foreheads together. He cups her face in his palms and feels her tears meet his thumbs. Hey, it's all right. Listen, you weren't wrong. I would have left. I would have left because love made me selfish too. Peggy's face twists like his words have hurt her. She shakes her head and pulls back to look at him, closing her hands around Steve's. I'm sorry I've kept you for so long, she whispers. Steve, I'm so sorry. I denied you, didn't I? I denied you the life that you wanted, that you deserved. I'm sorry. Pegs, don't ever be sorry, replies Steve, quiet, pressing devoted kisses to her knuckles. I loved you, and I love you still. I had the time of my life, Pegs, don't you know that? I had the time of my life, dancing the night away with you. But it's last call, isn't it? Peggy asks. Steve takes a long moment to wipe away all of her tears. When she's collected herself, she continues quietly. The lights are coming up, I think. It's time for you to go. She cups her strong, withered hands around his face. She does look the same as the day they met, despite what the years have done to her, despite the lies she has had to tell, the people she has hurt, the deaths she has seen. Her eyes are the same reliable, steady brown. He loves her, no buts. He didn't lie. Nothing can stop him from it, not even now. It burns in him, the same way he will burn until the day he sees Bucky's face again. And he will. Steve won't rest, not until he finds him. Wait for me, he begs Buck. Whatever hell you're in now, hold on, just a little longer, just for me. Wait for me. I'll come for you. I always will. I'll move heaven, Steve promises intently. And if that fails, I'll raise hell. But I'll make this right, Peggy. I'll bring him home. Peggy smiles, sad, faithful, tired. I know, Steve, she replies. I know you will. The Triskelion has changed over the years, and though it's still no longer Stark's long and straight Bauhaus monstrosity, it is still buzzing with suits and blanketed in glass windows. Director Fury's office is high up, but not half so large as Stark's had been. Steve takes the elevator, which is made of windows too, and by the time he is on the right floor, he can see all the way out to the Potomac. Fury's office is white and gray, and sunlight streams in hotly. Fury, uncaring, wears all black and even a coat. The eye patch jars Steve every time, but he doesn't show it. Instead, he falls to parade rest. Waiting as Fury hauls the box into the desk and dusts it off. There's a battered file next to it, courtesy of Agent Romanoff. Written across it is Projekt Zimnyefoin. Fury takes a step back and gives a sharp, quick salute. Colonel, he says. Welcome back, sir. Steve takes a couple steps forward and pries open the cardboard. He presses his hand flat to the white star of his uniform. You know what? Asks Steve. I really think I'd prefer Captain. Fury agrees, a smile maybe at the corner of his mouth. Captain, then? Well, Cap, I got one more thing for you.
He pulls it out from behind the clean lines of his desk. Steve can't remember it ever looking this nice. Though maybe that's because the last time he saw it was when he locked it up in his Shield issue storage unit years back. And it was still matte gray then. It's all spiffed up with a new paint job now, though. And the red, white, and blue catch the sunlight, gleaming brightly. I took some liberties, Fury explains, offering it out. The weight of the shield rests heavy and familiar in the crook of his arm. It's been a long time. This has been A Long Winter, written by Drop Dead Dream and What Are Fears, read by Shannon XL.